Hi, this is James Valvis, and today I'm going to be reading a poem entitled Some Poetry Magazines Seen in Poets Market. It originally appeared in 5 a.m., a terrific magazine that unfortunately is no longer with us, and also in my book, How to Say Goodbye. Okay, here's the poem. Some Poetry Magazines Seen in Poets Market. We don't want funny poetry, serious poetry, poetry that's funny but really serious, serious poetry that's funny, sad poetry, depressing poetry, poetry that rhymes, academic poetry, workshop poetry, nor do we want poetry by street poets, rants, didactic poetry, language poetry, poetry by the uneducated, and no-list poetry. No poetry written by men, by women, by little children or old people. Study your craft. We don't want political poetry, sentimental poetry, religious poetry, poetry about pets, poetry about people. No poetry with obscure meanings, and yet no poetry with simple meanings. No poetry with meaning. No poetry that doesn't make sense. And please, don't send us any of that poetry inspired by another poet. Also, no uninspired poetry. No poetry about poetry, no bitter poetry, no happy-go-lucky poetry, no translations of poets from other countries, or from this country, or poets without any country, no postmodern poetry, no modern poetry, no Middle Ages poetry, no ancient poetry. No poetry by beginners, no poetry by emerging poets, no poetry by the masters. We don't want poetry that's too short, or too long, or poetry that's neither short nor long. No poetry that came easily for you. No poetry you struggled over. No poetry you wrote. Poetry smelling of nicotine will be instantly trashed. No poetry mentioning names, race, creed, color, gender. No poetry with overt sex or violence. No poetry that hints at them. No boring poetry. No poetry inspired by the world around you, and no armchair pontification. No mainstream poetry, free verse, blank verse, traditional verse. Please don't send us nihilistic poetry, avant-garde poetry, Dada poetry, confessional poetry, beat poetry, concrete poetry, and no haiku. No poetry about streams, flowers, or the moon. No suburban poetry. No city poetry. No poetry inspired by TV or the movies. Poetry about death will meet a grim fate. No life-affirming poetry. No poetry that's subjective, or objective, or substantive. Greeting card verse makes us puke. Nothing elitist. Nothing democratic. Please don't send us any. This is James Valvis reading his poem, Some Poetry Magazines Seen in Poets Market. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share this poem. And as always, thank you for listening, and God bless you.